what is sashing? Let's imagine for a moment that I have these blocks that I want to put together. And I don't have enough of them to actually make a quilt, or I want to be able to separate them because when they go together, they kind of merge into one another. Okay, now when I separate them and put almost like a fabric border in between, suddenly, instead of them being all one big mess, you've got blocks that you can see as individuals. And they stand out much more rather than blending together. And there we go. Suddenly each block has got the equivalent of its own little border around itself to make it stand out. Okay. Now, whilst this is very easy having one big long strip there, it's very hard to get that to actually stay straight, because when you come to sew it together, you're trying to match this line and this line to get it to stay as a square grid across this gap. These strips are all called sashing strips, but especially if you're going to put it in a grid like this and not have them offset, it is actually easier to produce a nice straight quilt if, instead of having a long strip for your horizontals, what you do is you have little strips the same as the sides, and in the spaces in between where the horizontal and vertical lines cross, we have separate pieces like so. Now I'm showing you in a contrast colour. They don't have to be in a contrast colour, it's just for illustrative purposes. We could do them all in this colour and we get a similar effect to having the big long stripe in the middle from a distance. But by having these seams that you can match, the whole thing magically stays square. These are called the sashing strips. These are called cornerstones, or sometimes corner posts, or sometimes anchor posts. They all mean the same thing. They're where the horizontal and vertical lines of sashing cross in terms of the design. And because they are a separate piece, it's very easy to actually make that a variation and have contrasting sashing and cornerstones. And I think that's by far the most popular way of using sashing and cornerstones I see on the internet. But here's the thing. There is no rule that says this or this or this has to be one solid piece of fabric. There's no reason why this can't be a piece block in its own right. It could be a 4-patch, it could be a square within a square, it could be a pinwheel, it could be a 9-patch, it could be a little mini shoe fly block. Depending on the size that it ends up as, you can put anything in there. It could also be another applique block. Absolutely anything goes. And then when you realise that the same thing goes for these as well, these could be made from strip sets, so they're stripes. They could be, oh, I don't know, appliqued. So you have sort of, you know, lines of vines or something running through if you've got lots of floral fabric. Once you realise that these are something that you can also decorate, they become part of the overall design of the quilt rather than just a way to make your blocks stretch further. So what I'm going to show you today is a very, very, very simple way of using sashings and cornerstones in a pattern, and we're going to do a friendship star pattern. So I've got some small blocks here that have little cats appliqued on them, and I'm going to use for my blocks. My cornerstones I'm going to leave as a whole single piece of fabric in this contrasting colour, and I'm going to use that green all the way through. My sashing strips are going to have this as the background colour, but I'm actually going to add some star tips to them that are in nice, lots of scrappy colours, like so. Those are going to make my star tips for me. So what do we do? First thing is we've got to work out how big the pieces are that we want to cut. So let me get a pen. First thing to do is to measure your block. Now your block doesn't have to be square, it could be rectangular. Right? If it is square, then it makes it a hell of a lot easier, because the width and the height are going to be the same for all of your sashing strips. If your block is rectangular, you'll have some that are short and some that are tall. It's not impossible, it just makes it a little bit more complicated. Okay, so let's assume that our blocks are square. The first thing we're going to do for our sashing strips is the sashing strips height, that way or that way when they're on the side, is going to be the same as the height of the block. So it's going to be that big, is going to be how tall our sashing strips are. Sashing strip width is a bit more difficult. It can, to a certain extent, it can be any width. In this case, my blocks and my sashing strips aren't exactly that much different. But imagine I had big 12.5-inch sampler blocks. I don't have to have blocks that are nearly the same size. I could have really narrow sashing strips that are only 1 inch wide in the finished quilt. Or I could do something up to about 6 inches wide in the finished quilt. Or anything in between. There are only 2 rules. Well, 1 rule and 1 guideline. In terms of guidelines, the minimum width is whatever you're happy sewing down to. I like to do 1.5 inches because that will give me a 1 inch finished strip. Any smaller than that, and I don't really think there's any point in having the sashing in there as part of the design. But it is a personal thing. You might like it really, really thin. So that's our guideline. Now our rule is the max width of the strip equals half the finished size or height of the block plus ½ inch for seam allowances. So when it's finished, when all of this is finished, this block will be twice as big as this sashing strip if it is the maximum width that it can be. And that's actually what I'm doing. I'm doing mine as wide as I can do with this method. So my 4.5 inch block will finish at 4 inches. We divide that by 2 to get half. That is 2 inches. We add ½ inch on for seam allowances. That gives me a strip, which is the height of my block, 4.5 inches, and 2.5 inches wide. Ta-da! So that is my background strip. Now my cornerstone is going to be a square that is as wide as my strip is. Not as wide as my block, as wide as my sashing strip. So if I've calculated the width of my sashing strip as 2.5, then my block is going to be 2.5. So we're going to take those and put those to one side. And we're going to look at our sashing strips. The thing we're going to have to do to every single sashing strip. Now, There's my pile. I want to have a sashing strip that has a corner on this end and a corner on that end. So the way I'm going to get those is by taking some extra squares that again are 2.5 by 2.5. And in my case, because the cat applique in my blocks is lots of random colours, I'm using random scraps to actually do my squares. But it's entirely up to you. They could be the same colour as your cornerstones, they could be a different colour but all the same throughout the quilt, whichever you decide to do in the design. Now on the back of all my squares, I've gone through and I've marked 2 lines. You see those just about. Let me zoom in a bit. There we go. That's where my camera decides to move. Now I marked these using a friction pen, which is a heat erasable pen. When you put the iron over it, it'll actually come off, because these are going to be sewing lines. So when you do mark these, use a method that is not going to show on the right hand side. So I'm on the wrong side of the fabric. I mark one sewing line from the corner, from the very tip diagonally to the other tip. Then I do another one parallel that is 3/8 of an inch further in. Okay, that's going to be my second sewing line. And I've done that on the back of the whole stack of all my points all the way through. It's a great thing to do if you're sitting there with something like Netflix on and you're binge watching a series. You sit with these on a tray in front of you and just sit there and mark them all up. Okay, then you're going to take your strip, you're going to take your square, we're going to put it at the top of the square so that edge and that edge match. Not square, the rectangle. We're going to put the square at the top of the rectangle. That's what I'm trying to say. It's not so difficult, is it? Put the square at the top of the rectangle so that that side and that side match. And the smaller triangle I've got pointing this way, so that the one that goes from the diagonal point is into the very point of the rectangle as well, like so. Now it wouldn't matter if I had it that way round, it would still make a friendship star. But whichever way round you do it, and I started mine that way, you've got to be consistent all the way through your quilt. Otherwise, when you come to put it together, you'll find that some of your points won't make stars, they'll make other shapes. So, having put that like that, we sew. I've sewn down this line, and I've done a whole load of chain piecing of these. I've turned them all round, and then I've sewn down the second line. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to take the iron, we're going to fold that back, and that will give us our first star point. Once we've ironed that and folded it back, we're going to cut in between these 2 lines of stitching. Oh, one thing I should have said, I've got my stitch length set slightly shorter than normal because this isn't quite 1/2 inch. There is enough there to make a really good seam and really hold the block, but just to be extra safe, just to be extra secure, I'm actually going to do a shorter stitch length which will hold it tighter. Okay, you can either cut it now, or I was actually lazy. Look, what I did, because I wanted to get all my sewing done, was I put both of them on before I cut them. So press, press, cut, cut. Now, one thing I did forget to mention is that when you put your second square on, you need to make sure that your diagonal lines are running parallel to the first set. That way your finished shape is going to be like this. If they're not parallel, if you put it on the other way, so my diagonal lines are running that way on that one, if I then get another square where the lines show up really well, you can see if I put it that way, so they're running in a kind of chevron, what I'm going to end up with instead of the shape that I want is a flying geese unit. Now that is one way of making a flying geese unit with these sizes, but that's not what we want today, so try and avoid that mistake if you can. So when we put them on parallel, like so, and we press and then trim the excess away, we're left with some shapes that look like this one, and a stack of triangles that we've cut off there. Now these are officially waste, but when we open them up, we've got nice little tiny half square triangle units that are already pieced together. They just need a little bit of squaring and the dog ears taken off, and then they are ready to go into another project. So this little stack is almost like a little stack of bonus blocks that are partially made, ready to go into something else. So I'm going to put all of those on one side. I've got one that's not sewn for some reason. They go over there. So we're now ready to look at what it would assemble like. So we have 4 blocks. Like so. We have a cornerstone, goes in the middle. Oops. And then we have our sashing with our points on. That goes here and here. And here. Let's just get this last one. It's going to go there. There's our friendship star. We've got enough background colour to separate it from where the next one's going to form. Top, bottom and right, because we've followed that rule of the width being half when you look at the finished width of the block and the strip. Yeah, it looks good. As a variation, I could do something in here as well. It might look good with a 4 patch. I wouldn't put another half square triangle in there because it would just be too confusing with too many triangles. But it might look good with a square within a square. So that's another variation that I might do another day. But there we go. How to make patterned sashing in a half square triangle. Snowball style, and make a friendship star. Hi, if you're seeing this message, you just watched a quilting video on our family channel. As you can hear, we're into music, video games, Lego, lots of other things. So if you are thinking of subscribing, and I do hope that you do, you should know that we do have a quilt only channel that contains none of those things. There you'll find a shorter version of this video without this message, and plus hopefully lots of other videos over time. I look forward to seeing you over there. The description contains the link down below.